The ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Franks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an interesting switch. For some time now, I have been hearing my Republican colleagues complain about overregulation and interference with the private sector. Today, we are hearing complaints about underregulation and insufficient interference with the private sector. The facts are clear. Whatever was done incompetently, incorrectly, perhaps dishonestly, although no one has established that yet, was done in the private sector. The complaint is that the public sector didn't do enough regulation. Now, it is true that the financial reform bill is now in place, but it was signed into law in July of 2010. We have not yet seen its full implementation. In fact, one very important rule that's relevant to trying to deal with the problems here was just adopted earlier this month. And the way in which it was held up is relevant. The chairman of the commission, Mr. Gensler, who I think does a very good job, couldn't get the third vote he needed. This was not the first time. We had the same problem with regard to the anti-speculation rule. And I say that because this commission structure, which can lead to delay in the adoption of important rules, is exactly what my Republican colleagues want to engraft onto the Consumer Bureau, hoping, I believe, for similar results, much less effective action. But let's go back to the whole question of regulation. And members have said, well, the regulators didn't do a good enough job, partly because the extent to which we can expect our regulators to rely on volunteer help is limited. The regulators are not the Salvation Army. What we have are my Republican colleagues consistently resisting the funding that the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the primary regulator, and while people have said there were too many regulators, there was clearly a primary responsibility in the CFTC. I don't think regulatory diversity was the serious problem here. What we have is a significant lack of funding for the CFTC. These are complicated matters. They require intelligent people to do this. The president asked for $308 million, $117 million to be funded through a user fee. That is, the president wanted the additional money to come from those in the business. But my Republican colleagues decided to defend the financial interests of those in the business and rejected that, so that it all comes from the taxpayer. So first they make sure that we don't get money from the industry and it all comes from the taxpayer. Then they use the fact that because of them it's all coming from the taxpayer as a reason not to fund it adequately, because they say the taxpayer can't afford it. Although $100 million extra for the taxpayer from people who support the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, moonshots and everything else comes somewhat hard for me to accept too seriously. Let me ask you, how much time have I got, Mr. Chairman?
But
ask for
the ranking member has yielded you additional time. So
I thank you. They are inadequately funded. The Republican Appropriations Committee this year voted them $172 million, less than they got in the current year. That's for the next fiscal year. The Democratic appropriators did help to get it up to $205 million, but $55 million is kept from personnel and put only into IT over the objection of the CFTC. So the CFTC has been hampered. I also believe that a law that's been in effect only a little over a year, not fully a year when some of these events started, that's not an adequate test of the law. A fully funded CFTC, able to adopt regulations, would do the job. And I think my Republican colleagues have this dilemma. They are opposed to regulation in general. They're now saying, well, the regulation should be better, but I invite people to do a little content analysis in which we are told that these regulators are interfering with our private enterprise. You cannot logically and sensibly be for regulation in the particular when you have opposed regulation in general, having in fact disabled the regulators from doing it. And then there's one other question I want to raise, and that's the self-regulatory model. Much of this was self-regulatory model followed, and I have been skeptical of some proposals we've had to increase that. And I want to talk particularly about CME. And I have a great deal of regard for the people at CME. It is a very well-run organization. When we drafted the legislation, I was interested in their input. But I do want to raise a question as to whether or not there's a conflict of interest. The National Association of Securities Dealers, which FINRA is the self-regulator for the securities part, they spun off the regulatory agency from the people running the exchange. In CME, no such spin-off has taken place. And I don't mean to suggest in the slightest that there was any conscious softening by CME. I have too much regard for the people there to believe that. But human beings are human beings. And I believe one of the things we have to look at is if you're going to have an SRO, should it be spun off in the way that FINRA was spun off from the National Association of Securities Dealers in that exchange? Should we ask for a similar degree of spin-off if the CME and people in that area are also going to be an SRO? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and now the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for 1 minute.